Today we're here to welcome Richard Weisberg and celebrate the publication of In Praise of Intransigence, The Perils of Flexibility. And I wanted to do this event very much because I've read this book and it pushed me and challenged me. I'm a pragmatist, and I spend my time trying to get results. Which means I'm in that group of Washingtonians that bemoans the days of yesteryear when we could come out with compromises. And in my own professional life, I spent a lot of time finding moderate Republicans to work with liberal Democrats in the various causes I worked in, all of which are liberal. So you have, Richard Weisberg, you have challenged me to apply my pride of place, this is quoting you, necessary in my own flexibility to be an extended critique itself of that pride. And I welcome that. The other thing that's wonderful about this book is I'm a reader of Richard Rorty, both his books and New York Review and things of that, and he's a leading American pragmatist. But he can write a deep book and write it short, and Richard Weisberg has written a deep book and written it short. And writing it short means there is a discipline in the writing, so things are tightened there, and that's all to the good. You know, we believe in a democracy and informed action. We think that requires critical thought and reflection. And at the same time, we kind of recoil at words like zealot and sometimes stiff-necked, which is a word that I know Richard is familiar with, as am I. And we're challenged in this book by Richard Weisberg not to take the easy way out. That citizens who engage in public work really have to engage in public engagement. And it's not enough to say the other guys are inflexible. You have to be able to articulate and internalize and communicate your argument, and so that the opposition can grapple with it. But the central part that I get out of this book is how important it is to deal when you have emergencies and crises, whether it's 9/11, which is written about in here, or the time of Vichy France, or a time that you didn't write about, but which is an important time, the way we treated the Nisai in World War II. And when you think about it just anecdotally, the Attorney General was weak at the time and regretted it as time went on, Francis Biddle. 3 justices dissented, and they weren't Douglas and Black. They were the sainted Frank Murphy. I say sainted because he protected the workers during the strikes against GM in the 30s. Robert Jackson, who was as clear a thinker as we've had on the Supreme Court, and who talked about not having, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And he dissented. And Owen Roberts, who was a conservative, who was the 5th guy in making 5 to when the court defended some of the New Deal acts finally. So this book presents a rich set of cases that are just fascinating to read, including going back to early Christianity and dealing with Vichy France, dealing with the Constitution. So this is really an incredibly rich and thoughtful book, and it requires us to listen so that we get in touch with our own principles and can find our way. For me, as a pragmatist, how I deal with the tensions of pragmatism and principle, and sometimes the puritanical aspects that hold to standards. So let us welcome Richard Weisberg to Politics and Prose and hear what he has to say about intransigence and celebrate principle.
Well, that was just about the loveliest introduction that any author of a new book could have wanted anywhere, and from a pragmatist, no less. So I'm not opposed to pragmatism, as you will hear. I'm certainly not opposed to problem solving. By the way, I don't know if this thing is helping, but can you hear in the back? All right, so just two minor points of disagreement with that wonderful set of opening remarks I do actually talk about the Korematsu decision, which was the decision that during the war upheld, as I'm sure most of you remember, the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, mostly on the west coast of this country, just because of their ethnic heritage. A clear violation of our Equal Protection Clause. And yet our Supreme Court, and this isn't the first time, and I talk about other occasions, it's not the first time that, it wasn't the first, and it hasn't been the last time that the Supreme Court flexibly traduced and violated very clear principles that should have bound them to overrule those kinds of actions by our government. The other minor point of disagreement is that I actually do watch some of the soccer match. So the only thing I was hoping for today was that Germany would pull what it did against Brazil to enhance the representation of people in this store. But it was 0-0, at least when I left. If anyone has any later intelligence about that, just pipe up. But it is quite wonderful to be here, and the main thing for authors is, or at least let's say the second most important thing for an author on an occasion like this, besides the sale of books, is the Q&A. So I will maybe take about 15 to 18 minutes to talk a little bit about the origins of this book. Where did such a crazy idea come from? If you just look at the title, In Praise of Intransigence, which in our present world especially, where we think as Americans, especially citizens in 2014, we think that the whole problem that we're having is the problem of intransigence. People who set themselves into extreme positions, politicians who can go nowhere because they claim to have a set of views that they refuse to compromise. Why, I am asking my reader to consider, why would anybody applaud or make an argument for the trait of intransigence itself? And the subtitle of the book, The Perils of Flexibility, indicates that even though I'm certainly not opposed to flexibility in my ordinary life, I'm a lawyer, I deal with people in negotiating situations, and you definitely need to be flexible as you are dealing with people. The problem with flexibility that I cite in this book is that for too many of us, and especially those of us who think of ourselves as blue staters, people who are heir to a great tradition, not only politically of liberalism, but also of the Enlightenment and of a sense of open-mindedness. Sometimes, and too often through history, flexibility and otherwise wonderful means to an end of accomplishing something becomes the end in and of itself. And what we pride ourselves on is flexibility as a norm, not as a device to accomplish what we deeply feel we need to accomplish. So the origins, and here I'll take as my prompt the name of this great bookstore, Politics and Prose. The origins of the book are political on the one hand, and they're also literary. They also come from great literary works. Stories have had a huge influence on my way of thinking about a lot of things for a long time. And politics, like for most of you, is just something that we take in every day, not only in this town, but all along the network of blue state responsiveness as active citizens in this country. The political part of the influence behind my skepticism about flexibility grew out of post-9/11 developments. And these are developments you're all familiar with and which are still in the headlines. And the way I describe it, and I lived through this, would be something like this. On the 10th of September 2001, meaning one day before these tragic events, nobody that I dealt with, either as a law professor or really in my circle of friends, nobody believed in torture. We came as close as we could as a country which has so many different perspectives on 9/10 and prior to 9/10 to a virtual taboo. Then you have, and this has happened throughout history, but in our case, the most horrible event that's occurred certainly since Pearl Harbor on our shores, 9/11. And as early as 9/12, that taboo against torture was being equivocated, compromised, negotiated. Choose your own verb. And I saw this happening in front of my own eyes in discussions which perhaps many of you also took part in, which basically were asking the question, how do we respond to this terrible event? And people of the highest liberal credentials were rather quickly beginning to say, well, yeah, on 9/10 we were inalterably, inflexibly, and intransigently opposed to torture. Then we have this change, an event that changes everything. This has happened, however, many times in the history of this country and in the history of the world. An emergency, something exceptional, something we've really never seen before. And of course, there is some truth to those statements about what happened on 9/11. So, and this is what I don't think should follow automatically, so we have to ditch, put aside, or at least compromise what 24 or 48 hours ago we felt was a taboo. And from torture, we have had a series of policies that constitute what people describe as post-9/11 alterations from prior traditions. Now, alterations from prior traditions are not necessarily bad. In fact, I'm not against change at all in this book. I'm in favor of fighting for change when the prior tradition or policy is a bad one. What I'm interested in this book is to track the changes that take place in policies that were thought of as sound, as good policies, like the taboo on torture. And when there is a threat in your individual professional life or in our lives as a political community, when there is a threat that something that most of us felt was really good and sound, healthy, made sense, was good for us, is being threatened or changed because typically of some emergency or something that really causes us to think that everything is different now. It's there that I ask my readers especially to gird their loins, to stick to the program, and to be, in fact, intransigent. And that, my book argues, takes a lot of work because there are so many influences on us to be flexible. Flexibility, as I said at the beginning, is certainly not a bad thing. You want to be that way in your personal relationships, and my theory does not extend to personal relationships. Do not become intransigent within your personal relationships. But within our political and ethical communities, intransigence is sometimes the only way to preserve that prior sense of soundness and goodness that everybody around you seems to be ready to compromise. We want to compromise. We want to feel that we're open-minded. But there are risks of that, and those risks are demonstrated historically. They go back way beyond 9/11. They go back thousands of years. World War II, as David points out, is the recent example of an entire continent caving in the face of a madman, Hitler, whose views the vast majority of Germans, and eventually, as unfortunately his terrible policies made their way westward, France, which I talk about a lot in this book, the Channel Islands, which you might not know that much about, but which was an occupied territory with British traditions. And we find traditions crumbling in the face of what started out as really an abhorrence for Hitler's policies. How does something like that happen? What influences on basically good people in America post 9/11, in Europe in a far more severe and clear moral situation during World War II? What influences on you, the reader, on me? What influences motivate us to equivocate, to compromise, to change, to fold our tents? So that's the political side. And there's a lot about that in this book. I talk about briefly the distinction between red staters and blue staters. As a lifelong blue stater and as a child of the Enlightenment myself, as a quintessentially open-minded fellow, you never would have met anyone more open-minded than I. I also started to see that we have our group, and of course it's not true of everybody sitting in this room, but call them blue staters. Blue staters have certain prejudices against red staters, and I talk about that in the book. And I think the most damaging is they don't compromise. We feel that our political enemies, maybe their primary vice is their unwillingness to compromise. You can't get the people in the Senate to compromise. You can't, the Republicans in the Senate. You can't get people down south who have certain entrenched and fundamental views, typically about religion. You just can't get them to think about another perspective. It's bad to think about complex issues and make the primary way of analyzing them, my opponents won't compromise. It doesn't get you anywhere. It just is an easy out from thinking about what the actual issues are. And if all you want is to see your opponents show some signs of compromise, you're not expressing as well as you could your own beliefs that run counter to theirs. So there's a little bit here for red staters, because some of their arguments, even on things like teaching evolution in schools and school districts down south, and I teach this stuff in law school because I teach constitutional law. Some of their arguments, when you think about the First Amendment, are actually very, very interesting. I still believe that evolution should be taught in science classes and that we should not be giving equal time to the Bible in a science class. I still believe that. I've had to articulate my position better because I stopped saying they're fundamentalists, they're intransigent, as though that trumped every other argument that they're making. And you can go on and on with almost every issue that comes up now. So we have to stand firm for what we believe and articulate it, and not be distracted by saying our political opponents do not compromise. Why don't they come to the table, as though that were the most important issue? Again, our flexibility becomes a norm instead of just a means to an end. So the political side, there's much, much more in the book about this. But the literary side, call it prose, is in the book too, because 3 stories have influenced me greatly on this subject. And you're probably familiar with most of them. One is the great play Hamlet. And I'm going to just read a short portion of the book before opening up to Q&A about Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, which you all studied and I hope have kept up with in your adult life. And I also write about 2 early 20th century American writers, Susan Glaspell, whose story, A Jury of Her Peers, I absolutely ask you to put on your reading list. First you buy my book, and then find the Glaspell, A Jury of Her Peers, which is about 2 women in a farm community in the early 20th century bonding against all the odds, women who have almost no power, to stand up to a male community with their own deepest sense of the guilt or innocence of a neighbor of theirs who's been accused of murder. It's a brilliant, very short, 20 pages, by Susan Glaspell that originated as a play, Trifles, in Provincetown in about 1916, and then she worked it into this wonderful story, A Jury of Her Peers. And the third is a text by William Faulkner called Intruder in the Dust. How many of you, I'm just interested, how many of you have read the Faulkner? Okay, go for it. Intruder in the Dust is written during the Jim Crow period. So it's a little later in the century. And it's about a man of color, Lucas Beecham, who at the beginning of the story in Faulkner's deep south, rednecked, imaginary county, Yoknapatawpha, which he made up and which are in all of his stories, part of Mississippi, but an imaginary part, the assumption that this man has killed a white man is so strong that he risks being lynched. And through a series of friendships that he is able to draw on, this man, Lucas Beecham, the truth finally does come out in the story. Lucas Beecham, in this rather short novel, is described 7 times by the narrator as intractable. Now, intractable, by the way, is a synonym for intransigent. It's also not a word that most of us like. You say, well, X is intractable. You can write off X. You might modify it, X is intractable on that issue, but I've already told you that even there, we're not going to like X typically just because she is intractable. And here's this story depicting Lucas Beecham, a magnificent figure, as intractable. And I said to myself, this is what stories do for us. They change the meaning of words. They cause us to think about the fact that what we think is bad actually is good and sometimes wonderful. Intractability, and the word inflexible is used about him several times. And without those traits, he never would have been able to manage a few other, very few, sympathetic people, because he's in jail, to explore the guilt or innocence on the level of evidence of Lucas Beecham for this crime that he's been accused of. Now, Hamlet. A little bit of reading, then we open it up. Who has not thought about Shakespeare's troubled prince, and who has not needed to work through at least some of the many questions he ponders? To be or not to be, the most famous of these, asks whether to sustain a life defined by a slumberous incapacity to act can work. Conscience, says Hamlet, doth make cowards of us all. Conscience, which by the way means knowledge, knowing with. Conscience doth make cowards of us all, because sometimes excess reflection dims our allegiance to what he calls enterprises of great pith and moment. For Hamlet, the crucial question has become whether he will summon the fortitude needed to rid both the Danish throne of a murderous mediocrity, Claudius, and his mother, Gertrude, of a lecherous bedmate, the same Claudius, who is wholly unworthy of her. Hamlet responds affirmatively early in the play when his noble father's ghost gives him the horrible news that the new king has killed him to gain corruptly both his crown and his wife. The ghost enjoins his son to avenge that murder and to set the public and private Denmark right. The ghost's terms have merely confirmed what Hamlet's prophetic soul already knew. He will not act in a knee-jerk manner, but according to the judgment already deeply ingrained within the core of his being. And by the way, just take a moment, what I'm asking each reader is to find out, and there aren't a lot of things like this, what it is that resonates within the core of your being. I'm not asking you to become intransigent about the weather or even about most things that you have to deal with in your professional or community life. But like Hamlet at the beginning of the play, something hits you in your gut. This is something I've always thought was right or always wrong. Something within your core, and each reader will have his or her own definitions, but you have to think about it. Think about what it is that makes me tick. And at the beginning, Hamlet totally agrees with the ghost. His inner self, he tells us explicitly, believes in what the ghost is saying. So he will leap to his revenge and in the process liberate Denmark from a rotten upstart. The ghost tells his loving son to remember me. And so it will surely be, given Hamlet's utter faith in what his late father has revealed to him alone. His innately sound response shows that Hamlet flirts with intransigence at the beginning of the play. He decides, though, and you all know this, how does such a hero delay for 5 acts, which is great because now we have 5 acts. But what brings about that delay? This is what everybody asks about the play. What we know is that he, Hamlet, decides to become a compromiser, to negotiate the ghost's text, remember me, leap to revenge, clear-cut goals that he agrees with at first. He negotiates that text, and he puts it through the ringer of almost endless analysis. Seconds after uttering the noble speech that shows how much he agreed with the ghost, "Oh, my prophetic soul," he begins the long process of unwinding and equivocating a pure thought. Now, this is one of the reasons we might like Hamlet, because he's like us. He wants to think things through. And there's nothing wrong with thinking things through. The problem arises, as Hamlet indicates and realizes himself at the end, when, despite our sense, I call it our trained intuition, that something is working for us on a very important level. The ghost is right. I always thought my uncle was a lecherous murderer, and now it's been confirmed. Instead of working with that, we have influences on us, both religious and secular, and the influence of Hamlet, that gets us off track and distracts us not just for a while with analysis, but for long periods of time until typically innocent people suffer, which is, of course, what happens because of Hamlet's delay. There are 7 relatively innocent deaths in the play before he finally comes back to the resolve that he had originally. How much suffering has been caused in the world by flexibility? And I'm just going to repeat this question because we usually don't think this way. We think, well, everything that's going on that's bad is because of extremism and intransigence. A lot of what has gone bad in the world takes place because there are figures like Hamlet, and probably have learned from Hamlet, that endless delay, equivocation, analysis, parsing of a thought is a good thing by definition. So I'll just mention historically, Neville Chamberlain, and I talk about this in the book, Neville Chamberlain versus Winston Churchill. Now, you all know that Chamberlain, as a prime minister, went to Munich. By then, almost everybody knew what Hitler was, what he was up to. And Hitler utters some words like, "This will be my last territorial demand." And Chamberlain, who in my imagination of Neville Chamberlain, is a reader of Hamlet who plugs into Hamlet's endless delays. And he's staring evil in the face, but he's thinking, well, there's got to be something else that we can work with here. That hesitation, that infamous piece in our time, cost eventually, arguably, we can't rewrite history, millions of people, millions of innocent people, their lives. Yes, Hitler's intractability was a part of the problem, but grasping it and working intractably against Hitler, as eventually Churchill, who was also asked several times to compromise with the Axis powers, recognizing our opponents' intransigence, not to become like them, but better to battle against them, might have brought about, as I argue in my book, would have happened, I know this better, in Vichy France, if there had been enough protest, intransigent protest against the French regime's strange new laws, so different from French traditions, or in the British Channel Islands, where you had the great British traditions of due process compromised by indigenous British groups. You'll read about it in my book, with very, very few intransigent people. There's one in each country, Germany, France, and Guernsey, which is one of the British Channel Islands, that I talk about with great, great respect. And if you like, we can talk during Q&A about Lothar Kreisig in Germany, about Professor Jacques Maury in Vichy, France, and about Abraham Lanné, virtually the sole voices of direct protest against these terrible changes that they saw happening in front of their eyes in countries that had great traditions that they felt they needed to remind their compatriots of before they folded and went along with the horrible things that were going on. And that's sometimes what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Shall I sit here?
Yeah, and then you'll come up. That was wonderful. I always feel it's really a proud moment because one of the purposes of Politics and Prose retained so vigorously by Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine and the staff here is to have Politics and Prose be a space for the serious discussion of ideas and to challenge our own thinking. And you've met that standard beautifully. I want to just take a minute, and Richard has had a wonderful, in his professional work as a law professor, as an expert on law and literature and textual analysis, he's also able to write in a clear way definitions. So he writes, I define flexibility here as a constant willingness in the face of the inevitable newness of situations to compromise even deeply held prior positions. So that's a definition of flexibility. And then he goes on to discuss intransigence again in a simple sentence. I take intransigence to mean a resistance to the urge to shift malleably from traditions thought to be sound. Well, that's a very real working understanding of what this is all about. And as some of you know, I worked on the 1964 Civil Rights Act and some of the ensuing acts that followed. And one of the things that's striking in your points that you make, your three-part points when about not just saying the other side is inflexible or ignorant or whatever we say, but that we begin to engage their arguments. Well, in the 64 Civil Rights Act, in the Senate, when everyone knew the filibusterers were going to filibuster, what happened was there was a counter-argument made. And the proponents of the Civil Rights Act actually organized themselves by title. There were 9 titles of the Act, 8 titles of the Act, and there was a bipartisan team defending that each title separately that had responsibility to do that. Different senators that you will remember, such as Jacob Javits and Hubert Humphrey and so on, and that joined the debate. The Southerners stayed on principle. They filibustered, and for them it was an Alamo-like resistance. So the argument was fully joined, and that's part of what made it acceptable when the decision was finally made, that the public argument was joined in a significant way. And that really meets the point you were making about both principle and intransigence and how you reach a result. So thank you for that. And we'll now open it up to questions, and thanks for indulging me. And please use the microphone. It's a public meeting, so if you're comfortable, I can say your name. And Richard, you're up here.
Oh, all right. Hi, I'm Bill Sumner. Thank you, Richard, for that. If I understand your arguments, I think they're spot on with regard to the Vichy government, to Neville Chamberlain. But I wonder a bit about 9/11, if that just didn't create an epiphany in many people, that people who had very solid views that they were absolutely positive they agreed to, that changed their whole perspective of thinking in such a way that it allowed for an entire switch to a brand new intransigent point of view.
Thank you, Bill. I'm not a believer in huge paradigm shifts caused by single events. I know many of us are sort of trained to think this way because partly because of 9/11, but also because, now I'm going to say something in a slightly different way, newness is appealing, even in some ways when it comes in the form of something horrifying. Newness appeals to people of the mindset that I'm describing, the flexible mindset. I mean, in some ways, it's both cause and effect of our flexibility. It causes us to be flexible by definition, because if the sense is, and some of the writers I talk about who defend compromise say this explicitly, if the sense is that things that happen, not just catastrophic paradigm shifts, but everything, every day we wake up to a new world, and we should zap our kind of belief systems the way we would zap around the channels of our television set to meet the new experience. So a cause of flexibility is an attraction to the new, which I share, and it goes deeper, and it's a big part of the way lawyers think about things, which is that at least in America and England, that every situation that your client brings you is new. And that's wonderful. It's very creative in the same way that Hamlet is creative. But it causes a problem if we think that we can change, and should change, actually, all the time. And the effect of our flexibility is precisely that we then feel that we ought to be moving away from positions which very recently we thought were good positions. Throughout history, emergencies, sometimes in a fancy way called exceptional, periods of exceptionalism, have altered very decent people's views of how to respond. Emergencies are always conjured and sometimes created. And as a matter of fact, listening to David, the Lyndon Johnson that we love and admire the most was the Lyndon Johnson of the Civil Rights Act. And it wasn't because Lyndon Johnson was flexible about wanting that act. He was intransigent. His tactics were eminently flexible, a superb politician. But when we shift a little bit the focus on LBJ, we also think about the Vietnam War. And I don't know if you remember, but I do, though I was only 2 years old. No, I was a little older, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There are these incidents which create in the minds of even very thoughtful citizens a sense of emergency, a sense of newness, a sense of crisis that has to be dealt with, sometimes without reckoning with what we thought of and believed deeply in before. World War II is full of these so-called emergencies. The Reichstag fire case, if you look back at your history, in the early period of before Hitler actually had cemented power, the creation of an emergency, the Reichstag fire case, which historians now think actually was a fire set in Berlin by the Nazi Party itself, in order to foment a crisis and an emergency. And Hitler took on full powers after that. There's nothing new in any of this. It goes back 2,000 years. And David mentioned that I bring in a certain theological origin, I call it, of the notion of emergency. Because in the early Jesus movement, writers, brilliant writers, most of them Jewish, were conjuring the end of the world. And I'm thinking particularly of St. Paul. Now, 9/11 is definitely an emergency, and other things that happen in our lives are emergencies. The end of the world is the paradigmatic emergency to end all emergencies. Frankly, if I were convinced by one of you sitting here, maybe I will be. It's a long Q&A session today, that the world was going to end tomorrow, I would probably ditch all of my so-called intractable, nonetheless, I'm going out with friends to a great meal because I think that's an appropriate way to end a book party or book talk like this. No, there are other things I'm going to have to do because the world is ending tomorrow. Already set in motion in our traditions was not only a secular admiration of flexibility, open-mindedness, which comes from the Enlightenment, but a religious tradition that also believed in flexible departures from earlier established traditions, and we can talk more about what that is. There's a whole chapter in my book about this, meaning that those early Christian writings, and by that I finally, look at writings over 4 centuries. But especially I'm looking at certain New Testament texts, especially the Gospel according to St. John. So we have traditions that are both secular and religious that, sort of cause us to think that there are things that could happen that actually would erase everything that our mature judgment, I call it, everything that prior to that, our mature judgment called either good or bad. And I'm just asking people, since the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes, my favorite line, one of my favorite lines from the Bible, there is nothing new under the sun. Take that to heart. And once we flexible, we enlightened, we open-minded, also consider that alternative perspective. There is nothing new under the sun. Then when Japanese Americans start to be, or some other ethnic group starts to be, think about the immigration crisis right now. We look deeply into how we really feel deep down about that, instead of saying, oh, well, this is a totally new situation.
I think I'm very curious to hear what you have to say. I think Obama is has this character flaw almost of this compromising attitude, and maybe he's sort of learning his lessons. It's a virtue too, but I think he's gone too far. So I was curious if you agree with that, and if you think of if there's any particular things on which he has done that.
Which part?
What? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
In which Obama has...
Do you think that he has taken any actions where he has compromised his beliefs where he should have been intransigent?
Yeah, early in my book, I actually quote President Obama in a fairly well-publicized set of remarks that he gave, I believe, at a college near here in D.C. in May of 2013. And he was actually talking about torture. And he said explicitly, we have compromised our most basic values. So the way I think about the president, whom I really greatly admire, first of all, I would double down on what you said, that I believe that he has learned some lessons. For example, there's a lot less of the complaining about the other side's unwillingness to compromise that we saw in the first administration. And a lot more actually working, to get done what you have to get done in the face of opposition that sometimes seems intractable, but probably isn't if we again look at the possibilities of even working with the most intractable people when we definitely want to get something done. I think as far as post 9/11, I'm in line with a lot of liberal analysts of these policies in thinking that there has been a real movement in the Obama administration back towards the rule of law, because I think he deeply believes in that. It's really something in his gut. And there definitely is a lot of work to be done. One of this has to do maybe with more transparency, for example, than we're getting on a number of issues. But I think history, given what he was faced with, what he inherited in terms of 9/11 policies, I think history, although the record isn't written yet, will view him more benignly.
Hello. I find it very refreshing that you raise this kind of analysis. In other words, it's very good to have a culture start to examine these kinds of things. I believe that we're basically in a really big state of confusion, seriously, because I think most people know something's wrong, a lot's wrong, they're not sure what it is, they're not sure how to approach it, they're not sure about themselves, where they stand on it, and they get confused by all of it. Okay, so where is this? In other words, I believe we really need a new vocabulary, a new dialogue, a new sense of communication, so that we don't get hung up with red and blue and conservative and liberal and stuff like that. In other words, we have to be able to, one, find out what it is our values are, where we get them from, what reality is and likely to be during our lifetime, and how do we establish a comfort level of having a set of values that go with the reality that exists, and so that we can move on and basically survive. So again, thank you for raising this kind of a dialogue, because it's the beginning of starting to say, what's going on here? Where are we going? And for example, just quickly, we have to know better how to do cost-benefit analysis, because a lot of what you're talking about and a lot of what you're bringing up is cost-benefit. What is it worth? Where does it stand? What value do I put on it? And what could happen? You know, what's the threat to me, to my job, to my life, to my finances, whatever. So, but thank you again.
Thank you. It's hard for me to improve on even a single word of your recitation, except that last part. And particularly since an easy answer, which almost any author would give, would be, if you buy my book, you'll find that vocabulary. Will it soothe all of the anxiety that individuals feel, you know, in a period of confusion? And almost every age feels that they're living through, you know, a period of confusion. You know, that I don't know. And I do give some deference to normal human fears. It's just that we see in almost every generation there's the possibility actually of people summoning what they really believe in, standing for it, and arguing at the risk of their lives to others that they revive, which is a word from Martin Luther King, actually. He was always talking about reviving values that we had lost in his speeches, which I quote often in this book, instead of maybe too easy moving along to something different from that. The cost-benefit, I guess the way I would think of it, because it goes back to sort of pragmatism, I don't think the kind of the template I'm setting up here will be recognized as basically pragmatic. Although pragmatism has so many different, you know, it's a really huge tent. And even somebody who's influenced me a lot that I talk about in the book, Friedrich Nietzsche, who is not a pragmatist, is often now put into somehow the tent along with American pragmatists and others. The way I would do the cost-benefit analysis is once and only once you have decided that there is no benefit that could accrue that would outweigh the cost to you or your community of something that you hold dear, you're not, by definition, even pragmatically, and even doing that analysis, you are not going to give up what you hold to be dear. There is no benefit that could outweigh the cost to you of something that you believe in very deeply. Now, many people may think that you're just wrong or crazy, and a lot of people who have this belief are our mortal enemies now. So then the question is, well, you know, what do you do either to further your own sense of intransigence or to fight off, battle, contest the sense of intransigence by others who have done the same analysis but whose conclusion makes no sense to you? You know, so I think that there's some helpful rearranging of things here, and one could even apply a cost-benefit analysis. I'm sure that everybody in this room probably has something, and I'm not, again, talking about personal issues at all, probably has something that they deeply, deeply believe in, and it would take an awful lot of argument tending to try to convince them that, yeah, but now, you know, there are benefits that accrue that maybe you hadn't thought about before, so you ought to shift your position. But you have to really dig down to find it, because most of the world that we live in doesn't really think that way about things.
There's a kind of cottage industry in arguing over whether Mr. Obama is too terribly intransigent or too terribly weak and flexible and so forth. But it strikes me as most useful to see him in the tradition of Abraham Lincoln, whom he has most admired and on whom he seems to have based his own political style. And I don't have so much a question as asking for you to comment on the career of Abraham Lincoln, who apparently believed from the time he was quite a young man, that if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong, who said before he became a national candidate that sectional slavery was an unsustainable option, and who, although he did not betray it early on, must have had abolition on his mind from before the time he was president. But he was a leader who got out in front but not too far, who allowed himself to be anti-abolitionist. In 1861, when General Fremont freed the slaves of Missouri by military decree, Commander-in-Chief Lincoln rescinded that immediately, for reasons we can all understand. He defended abolition at first as a military measure, and yet this very slippery, compromising person with a clear ideal is today perhaps our most honored American. What do you think? I don't know my question, but I want your answer.
I'll only respond by quoting a man who I obviously also think of as having been one of our great presidents, and that was "with malice towards none," which goes along, I think, with the first part of the Gettysburg Address as one of the most magnificent and pithy statements. I think it was the second inaugural speech, 4 words: "with malice towards none." Now, how do you get to the point where vis-a-vis your most intransigent enemies and opponents who have just cost the country dearly, you say sincerely, "with malice towards none"? Part of the step to that is what I've suggested, which is intransigence, even among your dearest foes, foreign or domestic, in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think he always felt that way. Then he was like LBJ. He also did some things to the First Amendment that shouldn't have happened to a dog. And I talk about the First Amendment in this book quite a bit. Some recent cases that you're all familiar with. The First Amendment, there have been a lot of slippery slopes in the First Amendment. And Hobby Lobby, which hit the press after my book hit the press, I'd be very happy to talk to you about. I mean, Hobby Lobby never should have happened for reasons that are not usually brought out. That's the case involving church state and a veto by a religious community on part of Obamacare. And if we get to the Second Amendment and Justice Scalia, who's a big part of this book, well, talk about slippery compromising with one's own ideals in the Heller decision and in many others. That's the gun control decision. A man who pretends to be interested in textualism, in following the rules as set down in the text, and who completely betrays his own deepest beliefs in the writing of many of his opinions, Justice Scalia. There's a new biography apparently out about, he's a man of endless fascination. So I think on your account, which I will latch onto, Lincoln had certain intransigent beliefs, including the belief in abolition and in slavery as virtually the ultimate evil. And then, like any good leader, however, he had to work with his intransigent foes and eventually fight a war in order to implement those beliefs. Flexibility, negotiation were a tactic for Lincoln, not an end in and of themselves. Thank you for that. Yes.
May I ask? I'm very sorry if I'm unclear or beforehand. I must say that. But since not many people are here, I'm taking this opportunity. Thanks to the bookstore and to you. You're very kind. And my name is Dolma, and I'm a Tibetan from India. But even a person like myself, I've been living here for like the last 20 years, and I saw a lot of nitty-gritty stuff. I know we are the leaders of the world, and even no matter whether they don't like it or not, I know that you guys are like for us among the leaders, of the world. So, we are not asking that we should repeat what mistakes we did, no matter who we are, whether you're Chinese or Tibetan or Japanese or whatever, Americans and stuff like that. But yeah, on what I really want to say is leaving that behind and also move on, to be even greater. And this, it's so the history now, when I saw the last 20 years fly by like a year, and I know there's such a short time, and we have never treaded these new things. And I mean, some things that were available, but they were never given to us or shown to us. Whereas you said everything under the sun, I believe that no matter how much we squabble over petty things, that there's somebody, big brother watching us, or big daddy watching us, whatever. So that said, since I saw, as I said, the nitty-gritty part, as I'm kind of innocent, so I blurt out, and I will take the punch if people get mad. You see the genetics and biotechnology, and then now like you, Emma, the writer, I see a lot of you guys here, and you're quite different. And so how they use the progenies of those, and then now it's getting to the point that now I'm in America, and I will fight for my life, and I'm very smart, and I'm very good, and I'll be killing my own sister or brother on the other side in India or in China if they're living. So how the dirty ones, how they are using it? Did you ever come across that part? Or I'm sure it's being tackled. I bet. I'm so innocent to be knowing about those in depth, but I bet, because who will leave every corner? By now we have so much knowledge and computer and everything. That do you see those and the dirty ones using? Maybe take my kid to Brazil and raise up there, and then use it in China, and from there to attack Tibet and things like that. Which it's so efficient, cost effective. They get a best deal out of it with them. Of course, it's better to involve the good ones than the ones, no matter whether they have the control over by theft and by petty.
Thank you very much. Part of what I think you're asking, there are many questions in there and many wonderful comments.
Main is using your own to use against you for this kind of, because like terrorism, for me, there's no terrorism. It's the same network of people and their offsprings or whatever, or their kind of if it's like a family, it's a
putting
family
aside
tree.
China, for example, you mentioned China and Tibet, which my wife and I, having spent almost 5 months in China teaching in Nanjing and visited Tibet, know a little bit about. But two quick answers, and your question deserves much more time than we have. I think that information, you asked about information. How does one
Did you come across,
how does one work in a world in which there is so much information out there? So what we learned about that region in 4.5 or 5 months from my own students who were Chinese, from visiting, let's say, Tibet, is just a drop in the bucket. And even if you Google, as you might in the middle of a conversation, something that someone brings up, maybe we have a false impression of knowing as much as we need to know to make our decisions. So in foreign policy, it's proving to be extremely intractable. The problem is proving to be extremely difficult for us to figure out what's going on. And maybe we could do a better job there.
Yeah, right now I'm not so much asking about my country versus that and origin versus that.
Well, the last thing that you said, what my tactics, so to speak, could the tactics of the intransigent can be used against them. I think you said that, and there's no doubt about it.
Right.
But when that happens, you have to, if you feel deeply enough about it, you have to meet intractability with intractability.
Right.
Thank you so much for that.
Last question.
I'm Richard Danzig. I'm a Weisberg groupie following you from place to place, seeing you speak on these things. In that context, though, I wanted to just state a view and ask you whether this is your view or one you differ from. You start from a place that I completely agree with, which is an admirable engagement by us in the notion that flexibility should not be regarded as morally praiseworthy unto itself. But I wonder if from there you're moving to the notion that intransigence is also just a tactic, and that both of these should be evaluated as tactics, which seems to me to be right, but not as anything that has moral virtue. Intransigence doesn't have any moral virtue any more than flexibility does. And when we talk about these characteristics, what they are, as you just used the word, tactics, and no more than that, and we evaluate them according to whether they're well employed. either well employed from the standpoint of they're linked to something moral that we care about and is correct, or a good tactical judgment has been made that in this instance we ought to be flexible, and in this other instance we ought to be intransigent because it will further the ends that we care about. So Churchill, for example, we don't praise his intransigence about India, where he was every bit as intransigent against Gandhi as he was against Hitler. Not because of the tactic, but because of our view about the moral thing it's connected with. So my question is, do you really mean, as the title of your book suggests, to praise intransigence and give it this kind of value, or do you want to devalue both intransigence and flexibility and call them simply tactics?
You're a good groupie.
That's what you say to all of us, and we're so numerous.
The answer is, however, the former. I really do mean what the title suggests, to revalue the definition of a word like intractable, and not to see it as a mere tactic. This is your setup, I think I slightly disagree with. I don't think that I view intractability as a means to an end. Intractability is the glomming on, for better or worse, of a deep-seated commitment to a position, whereas flexibility is thought of as being, wrongly, the end position, the value above all values. Intractability is always linked and always gloms on to some kind of situation. Churchill against the Axis powers, Churchill in India. It's not really a tactic. It's something that, came from within Churchill. Talk about his trained intuition. Sometimes he was right, sometimes he was wrong, but it's not really a tactic. It is the thing itself. It is what makes a person tick in that particular situation. Flexibility too often is thought of similarly. Well, I'm flexible, and I'm showing that now. So I see that slight difference in your setup of the question, which is, a wonderful question. I don't see them as having the same moral valence. But what you said that's absolutely correct is we make moral decisions about the intransigent on the basis of the outcome that their intransigence, if they're powerful enough, brings about. That's true. But they're not thinking in terms of flexibility. They're thinking in terms of exercising something that comes really from deep down in certain rare situations that they think is right or wrong. And it's obviously we are there to say that it's right or wrong. If it means enough to us and it's wrong, we have to fight against it.
Thank you.